Hey ladies, another snow day. Here we go. So hopefully you won't be too disappointed by our short and sweet activity for today. But what we're going to do today is to review our notes from last time we were together, which is on the screen before you, talk a little bit about what makes plants so special, and then I'm going to give you some time to work on your term projects, your AR, and maybe read a little of your AR books if you have some time left over. So last time we were together, we talked about the supergroups of eukaryotes. So remember that eukaryotes have a nucleus first and foremost, and they have a membrane-bound organelles. So animals and a couple of our closest relatives, like slime molds, belong to the group Uniconta. Plants and their closest relatives, the multicellular plant-like protists, the algae, belong to group Archaeplastida. One way you can remember that is that plastids are chloroplasts. There are some other types of plastids that don't contain chlorophyll, so they have different names. But whenever you think of plastid, think of a chloroplast because it's one type of plastid. So Archaeplastida are those that are photosynthetic and produce all that oxygen for us heterotrophs. Most other protists fit into the SAR clade, and then those that are pathogenic fit into their own group called the excavate. So you will not have to know these names, just so you're aware of them and how scientists use these supergroups as not an official taxonomic classification, but a way to kind of understand how the evolutionary timeline could have played out. As we get more information, we'll continue to fine-tune this and hopefully find a new home for our lowly protists that don't fit in with really anybody. So again, just today's assignment, if you have your notes packet with you, you can copy these notes down. What I do want you to do is to comment a question that you have. This worked really well for our last e-learning day, that this assignment on Schoology is actually a discussion board. So all I want you to do is to ask me one question that you have about anything in chapter 26. So if you happen to have your textbook at home or your AR at home, you can take a look at those for ideas for questions, or after you listen to this lecture, just any question that pops up. After you're done, if you have your AR finished and your term project is all ready to go, feel free to read your AR book with any time that you have left over and just enjoy your snow day. All right, so chapter 26 links together the colonization of land with the diversification of plants and fungi. Because remember, if you can envision that big timeline we have in our classroom, up until this point in life's history, life had only occurred underwater. And this was primarily to protect living things from the sun as a laser, as that video said that we watched last week. That laser is actually the UV radiation, and until oxygen had built up to a substantial level, that ozone layer didn't form. But once that ozone layer did form, we were able to move plants onto land and to help to build those ecosystems. If you want to rewatch that video, it's surprisingly accurate for how silly it is. But the plants and the fungi together colonized land and really laid the foundation for all terrestrial multicellular life. So remember that this only happened about 500 million years ago, which is not that long ago for talking about the history of life on Earth. And the movement on land had some big challenges for plants. They definitely had advantages because they had unfiltered sunlight besides blocking UV radiation. Visible light is also scattered by water, so moving onto land allowed them to have better access to higher levels of CO2 for photosynthesis and also helped them have more sunlight. However, they were not really capable of standing upright and not having that buoyancy of water to hold their tissues in place. And of course, not having as much water was definitely a drawback. So this is a picture of what life could have been like probably about 400 million years ago. So 70 million years after the plants and the fungi colonized land, they grew and differentiated very, very quickly because, like most new organisms do, when they first move to a brand new ecosystem, that there's no competition. The first modern plants had some different structural arrangements compared to their ancestors, which were algae. The first main one that is really important as far as evolution is concerned is this idea of the alternation of generations. Now try to keep out of your mind modern plants. Modern plants that we see, or we will see eventually when this winter comes to an end, are always diploid, just like you and I are diploid. All of our cells contain 2 sets of chromosomes. But the very first plants actually spent part of their life cycle being haploid and the other half of their life cycle being diploid. This is a little odd to wrap your brain around, but it'd be almost like if an egg or a sperm cell in a human could grow and be its own organism for a certain amount of time. Now they can't, but the first plants to colonize land had this kind of this double life, where the haploid organism was called the gametophyte, and its only job was to grow, do meiosis, and to produce gametes. And then those gametes merged to form a diploid sporophyte. So we had this kind of additional level of diversity that we didn't see in algae. And this ended up not being a very efficient system because almost no organisms continue to do this today. The largest group of organisms that still have this kind of double life are going to be ferns. And they're barely having this because the gametophytes that are actually subterranean, they grow underground in the soil, and we never really see them, but we do know that they are there and they are haploid and they're multicellular, and their only job is to produce eggs and sperm. They usually do so whenever you have a big rush of moisture, of precipitation. Those will then merge and form the more familiar form of a fern, which is this big leafy plant that comes out of the ground. So it's a little odd to think about, but this alternation of generations just mean that they live half their life being haploid. So that was feature number 1 that really distinguished modern plants from algae. The number 2 is called a dependent embryo. So after fertilization, the embryo will undergo development while it's still attached to the parent plant, which is, again, a little odd to think about because we know this is true of many animals, especially like placental mammals. We're familiar with this, but the idea of plants doing this is actually pretty amazing. And you have to think about like when pollination occurs in modern plants, and those seeds that grow do have an embryo inside of them, and that embryo is receiving nutrition from the parent plant for a certain amount of time until that seed is fully formed. Once fully developed, that seed is like a little womb that will keep that embryo safe until the environment is just right for it to begin to grow into its own adult plant. Sometimes that'll be a few weeks later, sometimes it could be the next growing season. Those seeds are a great adaptation for modern plants. So adaptation number 3 that separates modern plants from their ancestors was spores. And again, not all of these traits continue to be seen in a lot of modern plants. These were just the very first plants to colonize land, had all of these features. Spores that have this special chemical called sporopollenin in their cell walls made them really, really strong and tough. And they were also produced from these extra special appendages, if you will, these growths on the apical meristems of the plants called sporangia. So sporangia are basically like the reproductive structures. They fill up with these little spores, then they burst open, and these spores are usually haploid, and then they will settle into the ground and grow into those gametophytes. So this is kind of the missing link to that life cycle, that if we start with the more familiar egg and sperm merging to create the sporophyte, that sporophyte grows, undergoes mitosis or meiosis, depending on the plant, releases those spores. Those spores then grow into a gametophyte, and the whole thing starts over again as those gametophytes release those gametes. So again, it's just another way of talking about this alternation of generation. Modern plants that produce spores include things like mosses and, again, those ferns. So they're considered a little bit more ancient and a little bit more old-fashioned, I guess, if you want to use that terminology. All right, feature number 4 that makes plants different from their algae ancestors is this idea of apical meristems. So meristems are regions that contain stem cells, and they're regions of perpetual growth. in plants. This is really, really unique and interesting because animals, again, don't have this. We grow up until, our late teens, and then we stop growing. At least vertically, we stop growing. But plants, especially woody plants, will continuously grow taller and grow wider as long as they stay alive. And that's how you can think of these 100-year-old trees in California's redwood forest that are just enormous. They're really, really tall. They're really, really wide because not only do they add vertical growth every year, they also have lateral meristems that grow an extra layer of the wood on their stems year after year. So this constant cell division allows the plant to continuously seek out new resources so it can continue to grow. So in modern plants, the apical meristems will make the plant go taller. So you can see those at the tip of the shoot and at the base of the roots. And then the lateral meristems in woody plants will cause the thickening, especially of that bark and that wood, if we think of in trees and shrubs. So some other cool traits that are really, really important, and this is what we've been talking about for the past week. I promise as soon as the storm clears, I will go check on your guys' plants to make sure that they are still safe and they're not too parched from our week-long experiment. But all of our modern plants, including our spider plants, have these waxy cuticles that cover them, and this prevents water loss in most of our terrestrial plants. They're trying to overcome these issues that they may have in moving from being aquatic to being terrestrial. And what we've been studying for the past week or so, these little stomata, this is an electron micrograph, so a little bit higher definition than our imprints with fingernail polish, but their job is for gas exchange. And as we let oxygen out and let CO2 in, another byproduct of photosynthesis, which is water vapor, is generally lost as well. So just keep in mind this general timeline for plant evolution. We first see them about 470 million years ago. By about 425 million years ago, they have grown to be to have those spores. And then by about 400 million years ago, we have all kinds of plant diversity all over the planet. Lots of these plant fossils, like we saw in the Rise of the Mammals video, are a really helpful tool for understanding ecosystems from millions and hundreds of millions of years ago. Okay, so that wraps up our notes for today. Even if you didn't have your notes packet, hopefully you listened and thought of a couple of questions. Comment at least one of those questions in the discussion board below and enjoy your day. Please reach out if you have any questions or need anything. See you guys tomorrow.